Hello, we are live.
Hey guys.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone. We really wanted to come on live today and share with you guys. It's Shabbat Shalom, and it's also the day that we're aligning with the cross. So we
Yeah.
really wanted to come on and share some things. So we're going to jump right
So
in.
it's kind of interesting. Today is the day of Jesus' death, at least on the Gregorian calendar. Like we've mentioned before on previous lives, there is some debate over which calendar should be used. There's like the Zedekian calendar, Essenian calendar. There's the traditional Hebrew Orthodox calendar. There's Gregorian calendar. Before that, there was the Julian calendar that was replaced by the. I mean, it gets into the weeds really fast. So but we wanted to at least get on and talk a little bit about some of the things concerning the miracle that his death on the cross was for each of us. I mean, this is literally his death, burial, and resurrection are literally the defining moments of all of our faith. You know, those of us who follow God, this is the defining moment of our faith. Nowhere in any other religion does the God or deity die for the redemption of his own followers, which that alone is kind of astounding. You
Yeah.
know? But this act that is the death and resurrection, and we say both because honestly, like even Paul talks about, without the resurrection, the death is meaningless.
Mm,
Just wow, what that's really sad that really nice man named Jesus died a long time ago. What a bummer. Like that's all that event is if there is no resurrection. So
mm.
we kind of talk about those two things really in tandem for that reason. But he is the power behind all of our hope, all of our trust, all of our faith. And so it's really an honor just to even be able to talk about this kind of thing um,
Yeah.
at all, because it's wow, what a privilege. But our goal at Inspired Life is really to create a community, right? To celebrate the foundational Hebrew roots of our faith, and to share what we are learning and living out. We're in the same life journey, same life process as you are, and we are learning. We are always learning. And so we would like to, in the spirit of that, like to also hear about what you're learning and experiencing. And that's really, part of what the community is. We have a shared wisdom and learning and understanding, and nobody has time to study everything, right?
Right.
So to have different parts of the community, there's things that are on your heart that you get interested in, and now you have something to really share with the rest of everybody else. So
Yeah. And like Dan was saying, the first thing we want to talk about a few things tonight, a few things that were on our hearts that we actually were talking about a couple days ago, that we thought, oh, this will be great to talk about on Friday. So we wanted to look at the calendar and first kind of talk about that, because usually on the Gregorian calendar and the Hebrew calendar, Passover is when Jesus died on the cross. That is the night that Jesus fulfilled the Exodus when the Israelites were taken out of bondage, right? That is the fulfillment of that. And so that doesn't happen until next month, because there was an extra month added into this year. This is the what they call the leap month. They give us 2 months of Adar. We just finished that, or we're
right.
finishing up that. So Passover will be celebrated on April 22nd next month. So because of that, the calendar is very it's off an entire month as far as kind of aligning with that. And it's relevant because, like we said, Jesus fulfills everything that the Old Testament foreshadowed. He
Yeah.
is the second Moses. He is the second, all of those things, right? So this is so powerful. And what we wanted to do is really talk about preparing for this Passover season,
Yeah.
because it's sort of like I'm looking at this and experiencing it as a season, right? So on the calendar, the Gregorian calendar, we're going into the season tonight. And we're going to be talking about this over the next month as we do prepare our hearts for Passover. And we know that this year there is so much warfare going on. And it feels in my heart like it's more than usual. It feels very intense. And there are so many signs that God is moving, like the eclipse coming up, which we're going to talk a little bit. We're going to be preparing for that. It's a week from Monday. Very, very cool, on the 8th of April. If you haven't watched our last two videos, we really dove into that. But it is a sign. There are signs in the heavens. God tells us about that. So we're excited to do that. But so Passover is a redemptive act to heal your heart. That's what the Passover is. And it's about Jesus. That's what his crucifixion was about.
Mhm.
So we want to enter into this season with hope that God gave us and was sealed through this act that his son did for us. So it gives us hope, right? But we want to just kind of address that if your hope is deferred, if you're finding it difficult to have hope, then when it's deferred, it's difficult to receive the love, this love of God. And we desire to fully receive the hope that God has for us. And we know that this is a reminder of the lengths that he took to ensure our hope and our redemption through Jesus. So first, you have to shift your hope and your trust from the world, man, and yourself. And that's a theme that we talk about because it's a theme that we have to constantly die to ourselves, die to our own self-reliance. So we want to break from trusting in that first and trusting in God first. Because when our hope is renewed, we trust more in God, right? When you're feeling hopeful, you're feeling trustful, you're like excited, what is God going to do? But what if you're not feeling hopeful? And what if you're not feeling very trusting of God?
Right.
And it's really powerful because our mindset, our perspective, how we see God and what kind of God we worship has a tremendous impact on how we live and how we feel.
Right.
And an amazing example of this is the parable of the talents. It's a parable that probably all of us know.
Yeah.
We all know the parable. It's in Matthew 25. And you read about three men and their different experiences of God. And it's how they had to take responsibility for this borrowed wealth or this talent that they were given. And how they did that was completely up to each of them. And it's an interesting thing to look at.
Yeah, because it was money, unfortunately, because talent, and then we have a meaning for talent, and that's kind of gotten a little bit fuzzy, but this was money.
Yeah.
And it's important to note that even the guy that got one talent, that was an unbelievable amount of wealth. That wasn't like, oh wow, so that's the guy that got, no, he got a ton. That was a ton of money back then.
Wow.
So he was, and the interesting thing is back then culturally, what you would do when you were holding money for somebody is you would literally go into the field and bury it in a hole so that you kept your integrity intact. You could literally say, okay, I will go to the place where I buried it, dig it up, and hand it directly back to you, just so that you know that I had integrity as I was holding it.
Interesting.
Right? We'll get to that in a second. So the first two men obviously were familiar with this story, so I'm going to shorthand some things. They multiply their wealth. They believed that this was a blessing that was given to them, and they honored that blessing that they had been bestowed with. And so they took pride in their master. They took pride in the responsibility that they had been given. They had joy in their work, and they duplicated it. And as a result, they were invited to share in their master's happiness as well. Now, the third man had a very different view of all this. And there's a couple things that I think are interesting. So he had a very different experience and, of course, a very, very different outcome. First of all, he was fearful of his master. He was afraid of him, right? He said, you are a hard man. Like he was afraid of him. And then he made excuses, right? Excuse why he wasn't able to do this. And so in doing so, he's challenging the integrity of his master. And the master, in response, didn't argue with him. He didn't defend himself at all. He simply asked him a question. If this is what you really thought of me, then why didn't you at least deposit it in the bank so that it could earn interest? Like, if you really truly in your heart believed that I am a hard man, then why did you not do that? And so it's interesting because he didn't even act on his misunderstanding of God. He misunderstood God to be a hard man. And if he really believed that, he would have put the money in the bank with the bankers and earned interest. So he didn't even believe his own misunderstanding. That's how messed up our thinking can get, you know, when we have these sorts of things filter in. And so the misconception that he had of his master created an isolated, defeated, and hopeless life. And at the end, he was not invited to participate in his master's happiness. And, you know, I think we can probably all find ourselves in these servants. And that's what's so amazing about these parables, right? Is these parables speak to all of us. We've all had seasons or times in our life where we've been given something that we didn't do anything with. We all know people from high school or college, or maybe just at some of the jobs we've had over the years where, oh my gosh, that person was so unbelievably talented. And then I'll give you an example. So probably, unless you're a real deep into the weeds basketball geek, you would not know the name Lloyd Daniels. Lloyd Daniels was a prep star, New York, street baller extraordinary. I mean, this guy was legendary. And the things that he could do, people were talking about, like, okay, this guy is Michael Jordan who? But unfortunately, Lloyd Daniels liked drugs more than he liked the game of basketball. And that's why, to this day, most people never heard the name Lloyd Daniels, but everybody knows Michael Jordan.
Yeah.
And so that's the thing, that wastedness. We've all had seasons of that in our lives, and we all know people who have done that with their lives. And so this is why this parable is so timely and so important, because we don't want to be that servant, especially when we don't have to. Like, that is not something we have to do unless we choose it. Unless we choose it. But this reality that this third servant created for himself, he created this alternate reality purely based on his own misperceptions. And so in a sense, he kind of lived a self-fulfilling prophecy. His view of God, and likely himself, was exactly what he experienced. And so this is why how we see God, how we relate to God is really the most important thing we do with our lives.
Yeah. Because if we view God as a harsh, distant, unjust God up there, you know, like pulling puppet strings kind of a thing, we will completely miss the safety, grace, love, and purpose that he offers. And in our lives, one way or another, it's going to reflect our perspective of God. So it's an interesting thing to see, what are you experiencing when it comes to how you view God. And it's an interesting thing, because we're not here to judge that. We're not even here to tell you that it's wrong. We're here to bring it to light, because it's this important. This is why Jesus went to the cross, was so that we would understand this. And I was talking with someone this week, and honestly, that's what sparked the conversation that I had with Dan, and where I was like, gosh, I would really like to talk about this on Friday, because she was really hurting and she was wrestling with this Passion Week. She said she was really wrestling with the inhumanity of the cross and celebrating a God that inflicted harm on his son and ultimately on his followers. And it was really really intense listening to her and feeling her pain. And it felt so hopeless and cruel that we were celebrating this act, because ultimately it was like celebrating this, that there was someone that had to be tortured and punished and even to death, because it's what we deserve, because we're just broken. And it was like I got this glimpse into this struggle going on in her heart that was somewhere between the shame and guilt and a legalism and a religion that she had been brought up with and was
Mhm.
really, really wrestling with. And there was
Yeah.
anger. There was this anger. She was just, and I could feel it and I could see it. And
You know
it
what?
really,
What you said, that it reminded me of, it's almost like a cognitive dissonance where you have two different ideas that you're trying to hold on to simultaneously.
yeah,
It just doesn't
right.
work, right?
And you can't. It's like, how do I bring these, reconcile this?
Right.
How do I reconcile this? Because it left her feeling like this had to happen because I'm so bad. My heart is so deceitful that I can't trust any of it. Like all these old things that were, and it was really awesome because she shared a lot and got a lot out.
Yeah.
And as we were talking it through, I really had a heart to imagine how misunderstood that was, you
Mhm.
know? And it made me think about how so many times in Christianity, we identify as that, as these broken, powerless sinners. And there's so many scriptures that talk about who we are in Christ and who we are in God, and we're made in his image, but we tend to really focus on those those ones that we feel like, that brokenness. And so it made me think, where does the Bible call us broken and powerless? So I went to Romans 5:6, and it says, you see, at just the right time when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Yes, the word powerless, this is used in English, but looking at it in Greek, it's the word, I don't know how to pronounce Greek. So it's spelled
Asthene.
Asthenes. So
Asthene.
I'm asthene,
Asthene.
asthene. Nice. Well done. Someone who knows Greek, or knows
Well,
the,
well, yeah. I can pronounce some words, but no, I wouldn't say no. That's a little strong, honey.
yeah. But it's really interesting when you look at these words, when you look at what the meaning of the original
Yeah.
Hebrew or the Greek, the New Testament, right? But that means without vigor. So powerless in our English language means without vigor. It means living in a state of weakness or sluggish in doing right. And I think we can all relate to that feeling. And it
Yeah.
does feel a little bit powerless, right? We feel like, oh, I can't. I'm not able. And so my question is, what does that bring up for you when you think of it that way? It doesn't really have a connotation of bad, or
Right.
we can't trust our heart because it's so deceitful. It's more like it's exhausting. it's
Right.
it's difficult on our own strength, because we do need Jesus to save us. And that's that thing we were talking about, is how do we reconcile that? And what our power is in our ability to respond to that.
Right.
Our power lies in our ability to take that help, and when we realize that, we get to experience new life and new possibility. And it makes me think of, in grief recovery, when we talk about, we need to take 1% responsibility for how we're responding today. When we
Right.
have things that have happened in our life, we have trauma, we have loss, we have painful things that keep us in these places that are it's not easy to connect or trust or feel that hope. And
Right.
so I guess what we wanted to just say is there is hope. That there is, it's possible. And we do have the ability to respond to this message.
I think that's a key point, because I think a lot of times there's this association with powerlessness of being choiceless.
Ah,
Like in other
yeah,
words, you don't have any choice. It's just,
right.
and actually the power of choice is the gift that God has given all of us. God did not create us as powerless. That is the
Right.
product of our choices, right?
Wow.
Our choices lead to life or they lead to death in all its forms. I don't just mean the physical sense of life and the physical sense of death, although ultimately, yes. I'm talking about just how you experience life. Like whether you experience not a perfect life, not like everything is always roses and stuff, but there is a general sense of joy and purpose and meaning that is infused with your life versus, like Thoreau talked about, living a life of quiet resignation. So that's the dichotomy that we're trying to look at here. And it is hard because admittedly there is a lot in Christianity, in our faith, that is paradox, right? It's kind of a theme, in a lot of ways, right? On one hand, human beings are an infinitesimally small, insignificant blip in God's created universe. On the other hand, God loves us with an unbelievable, incomprehensible love that we can never get to the bottom of.
And he knows all the hairs on our head.
Right. Like both of those things are 100% true. Right. So anyways, it's just kind of interesting. So we're given, though, the hope in the form of Jesus to become what God intended when he created us in his image. Jesus represents, this is what God meant us to be. This is the what God meant for Adam to experience with him, with Eve to experience with him. This is what it was, because Jesus was 100% human and also 100% God, and relied on. Jesus demonstrated this is how human beings have a 100% connection and relational intimacy with God. That's what he lived out. And so in Romans 7, there's an illustration of what life looks like when we rely on our own strength. And it's not pretty. These are the, Paul, but I appreciate Paul's honesty. There's a certain comfort in that. He's like, oh, cool. I'm not a complete dirtbag. It's like, no, Paul wrestled with this. This is something that, human beings wrestle with until finally we find perfection in, our perfect bodies and a restored earth and living in eternal bliss with God. Like until that time, this is what we're dealing with as we're in our human bodies, right? The things that we don't want to do, we do. The things that we do want to do, we don't do. I mean, there's that back and forth, right? I think I'll just speak for myself. I know that one very well. And so God created us wonderfully and perfectly. And then the sin that was chosen, right? That was a choice. It's not a gene. It's not in the chromosomes. That was a choice. That creates a deviation from God's perfect plan, right? And this is what influences and distorts our lives, beliefs, and truths, right? But we can overcome that. We do have, God is giving us a way to overcome that and experience what's described in Romans 8, which is where Paul reminds us that we are all more than conquerors. Right? We don't just win. We're literally living in victory. It's becomes our new reality is victory. We win all the time. We never lose.
Wow.
We reach that point. I'm like, that's where, we're not there yet. but that is where we do get to. We can experience that, right? And so this is why we build on Jesus. That's why he's the cornerstone. That's why we're so intentional about healing anything, whether it's trauma or wounds that are keeping us separated from receiving and experiencing the power, love, and soundness of mind that we have in Jesus. All healing ultimately is found in union with him. There's paths that get us there. Like I think grief recovery is a wonderful way to get to the path, but it is not the path in and of itself. God is the path, right? Grief recovery just sort of gets us to the path and then it leads to him. Or other things, self-parenting, a lot of the different things we do. And I think that's important because, we live in a self-actualizing, self-empowerment age. And as wonderful and amazing as human beings are, there are limits. There are limits. And if we think that we're just going to manifest our own healing, we're really setting ourselves up for a disappointment. We can partner with God for healing, absolutely, but it's we don't just self-manifest stuff. It has to be built on Jesus, right? In Jesus, it's all truth, all understanding, right? And so I'm going to suggest to you that weakness comes from believing what the world says about us rather than what God says. Weakness comes when we believe we need something outside of ourselves for life. We think somehow God isn't cutting it. I need to go out there and find life. And believe me, friends, I get it. I get it. It's hard to be a human being right now. It's hard to be a human being right now. So the desire for just a break, just some relief is intense, But that is all possible in God. It's all possible in him. And so the Spirit dwelling in us is what empowers us to seek that out. It's what empowers us to live in alignment with God. And I love how, Paul describes this, saying his power, meaning God's power, is made perfect in his human weakness. It's an amazing picture. And again, back to paradox, right? God's power perfected in weakness, right? It's because you see a demonstration of this is how amazing God is. Even our weaknesses are converted into strengths when we're working in partnership and union with God.
Yeah.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And so Paul goes on to say that he's going to boast, he says, all the more gladly about his weaknesses, because every time he's talking about his weaknesses, it's another way to demonstrate and illustrate the power of God at work.
Yeah.
And he remembers this because he also declares that he has the power through God to demolish arguments and strongholds, right? Philosophies, ideas, right? That set themselves up against the knowledge of God. And part of that knowledge is who God is and who we are in him. That's part of what that knowledge is that Paul is describing in that chapter.
Yeah, so powerful, man. So powerful. And I heard this week and I loved it so much. And it's this very simple phrase, and it says, remember that fear moves Satan and faith moves God. And that's really powerful to think about. And I think about that. It was this reading about the parable of the talents. I was thinking about that the first thing that the one struggled with was fear, even fear of God. But fear moves Satan and faith moves God. So we know that Satan's native tongue is lies. He's a deceiver, and he especially loves to attack us and lie to us about how God feels about us.
You know what? Can I just throw something really quick in there?
Yeah, for sure.
Because I love that. And I also think that in addition to lies, it's condemnation. Right?
Definitely.
The enemy, if you're ever wondering who's talking to you, if it's coming in the voice of condemnation, it's coming from the enemy.
Yeah.
Coming in the voice of conviction, then it's from God. Right. And the difference is, condemnation is telling you how horrible and awful you are. Conviction is, I love you. I want you to do better. I love you. I want the best for you. This is not it. This is leading you away from the best. That's the voice of conviction. Condemnation says, yeah, you suck. You're so, look at you. That's condemnation. So if you're ever wondering what voice is coming at you, that's just an easy way to identify it.
Yeah, so true. So true. Yeah. And we know, we're coming up, we are in this season of Passover. We're in this season of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And it can be confusing to understand, like Dan was saying, trying to figure that out, and why that Jesus had to die this death for me, for us, for all of us. And it makes me always think about tonight is, when we are there and we got to be there, we got to go to Israel and go into the Garden of Gethsemane. And I can still remember what it felt like to walk into that, open that gate. And it literally felt like my breath was taken away. It was just so powerful the whole time we were in there. And you think about him praying to surrender to this task that laid ahead of him. And he prayed so intensely that his sweat became blood and his heart was broken because he so yearned for us to understand God's love, the Father's love. He desired that we would know God the way that he did. Like Dan was talking about, living in that kind of intimacy with God. And that his love and relationship was never meant to be legalistic and religious, ever. Ever.
Yeah.
That's why Jesus came. He was like, these laws are not it. This is not how my Father created you and created you to have the relationship with him. So one of the things that we wanted to ask tonight was to really look at what is your perspective and understanding of God's love and how he sees you.
Yeah.
One of the amazing, this is just popping into my mind, an amazing thing that somebody recommended that I do early on in my walk with Jesus was to look at the passage in 1 Corinthians 13 where it says, love is, what's the first one? Kind?
Love
Love
is
is kind.
yeah.
And
No
to
method of
replace the word love with God
yeah.
and go through and see God is kind. Wow. I remember, and she said, and write down what comes up. And I remember just being like, wow, God is patient. God is kind. Patient is the first one. I remember like, oh, wow. I didn't even get past the first one. And where I realized I don't really believe that God is patient. I'm so impatient. My experiences from my dad, everything, I was always impatient. And so I realized in that moment, that's how I view God. And it was really, really powerful, very powerful. I still have it. I mean, this was in 92. No, 94. Sorry. 92, I got sober. 94, I became a Christian. So this was in 94. And I remember this so vividly because it was really earth-shattering for me to really look at, wow, this is actually how I view God. And
Yeah.
I'm doing my best to be good and to do all these things, to do, but we're human beings, not human doings. We are about being and being connected to God. So we really want to just kind of take this time tonight while it's Shabbat. We're moving into that time of surrender, that time of trusting God and trusting him, not being anxious about anything, and really being intentional about how are we receiving this? How are
Yeah.
we able to do that? um and how, because if anything is stopping you from fully receiving that redemption, we want to encourage you to reach out. We'd be
Yeah.
happy to talk with anybody. If you've done some grief recovery work, if it's possible to do more, or if you want to talk about what does that look like, what do we do in that, could that help? We believe that it has helped us tremendously
Yeah.
to heal from things, to be able to receive God's love in a much deeper way.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that I love, John Eldridge has something called the Pause app, which I highly
Mm,
recommend to you. It's free, and it's
so good.
wow, that has been such a blessing. But one of the meditations in there is just talking about in Scripture how Jesus loved the world so much that he died. And God so loved the world so much that he gave us his only begotten Son to die, right? And one of the meditations that just always sticks with me is he shares and he says, I am worth the death of Jesus Christ. That's how much God loves me.
Mm,
And I love that because I think that beautifully illustrates the paradox. On one hand, I'm so separated from God because of my own choices. And yet God is literally giving the life of his son to ensure that I have a chance of reaching him and knowing him. Like if you want to know how much you're worth to God, you don't have to wonder.
Yeah. Yeah.
You don't have
Yeah.
to. And if you're a parent, you just think about that. You think about how much would you have to love somebody for you to be willing to give up the life of your child.
Yeah. That's intense.
Wow.
Yeah. That's very intense.
That's a love I don't even comprehend.
Yeah.
And yet that's what God is offering. He's like, look, I want you to know. I don't want to just say, oh, I love you. I don't want to just put it on a bumper sticker or a Hallmark card. I want you to know how much I love you. And so there can be no greater gift than the one he offered. And that's what
Yeah.
I love about that.
Yeah. It's
That
so good. It is a great app. And I love this idea of this season of Passover of 2024 in the year 5784. And we know that this is the year of the open door. And one of the things I love Kurt Landry, and he's someone that we follow. He does a lot of great sermons and talks a lot about the power of understanding the foundation of Jesus, the Hebrew roots, and all of those things. But he talks about this being the year of the double door. We're going through a double door, and he's
I hope
kind of
so.
saying, yeah, that what he sees is that there's going to be a breakthrough time of double doors that will realign and reset for the next 10 years. And I just loved that. Right when I heard it, I resonated with it in my heart and in my spirit. And I just felt like, yes, I wanted to share that tonight. Because one of our goals here is to prepare and to come to the Passover table, which is an appointed time. It's a Moedim. And we want to come to that cleansed with hope, trust, faith, and love, and with a great expectation of what God wants to do in our lives.
Wow.
Psalm 23 and 24 are incredible psalms to read this season. Psalm 23 is known as the Passover Psalm, and you know that it's one of the most famous psalms out there, and it starts out with as I go through the valley of the shadow of death, and his staff and rod comforts me. That is about Passover, and it's all about his promises. So we're going to be unpacking that in the next week or two as we prepare our hearts for Passover. So we love this time, and we feel we're ready to enter through the double doors. We're ready to enter into the next season, and we know that with that will come testing. And we like to say, I loved how Kurt Landry said this too. He's like, will come attacks, right? Well, attacks are testing. It's testing. And we know that we're being refined, and we know that we will come out on the other side.
Yeah.
And one thing that we have to do is to not fear,
Yeah. And that's a choice, right? Fear is, and I think that's an important really, because fear is something human beings we contend with, right?
Yeah.
But fear isn't actually real. Danger is real, no doubt about it. Danger is real. Fear, however, is a choice. Fear is a choice. And so a lot of that just comes from where our trust is in. If our trust is in God, then we don't fear.
Right.
That's why we're giving these tests, because God, this isn't like algebra class where God's trying to like give us an exam. And when he's testing us, he's saying, look, you need to know for your own sake how deep your trust really goes. You need to know that for you.
Right.
I already know. So this testing is for you to see how deep your trust goes, because if it isn't, it needs to go deeper.
Yes.
And there's no other way to see it. There's no other way to see it than when we're in trial. So these aren't just random things. God's not bored running the universe, and so he's trying to throw stuff on our way and, oh, well, that's interesting. Let's see what they do with this. That's not God's heart. God's like, I love you so much that I know your trust in me is going to be your path forward. Therefore, I'm going to do everything in my power to help deepen and strengthen your trust in me. because we aren't called to fix it or make it happen. Our call is to trust God and bring to Him anything that we need to be healed. Whatever is in our way, whatever obstacle, that's what we bring to God. That's our part. And then God will take care of the rest. And so this is really a time to lean into Him tonight as we're entering Shabbat, as we're entering Shalom, and remembering, what the disciples must have been experiencing. This is the defining moment of God's power, and that is, the resurrection of Yeshua. And so this is the moment, right? The resurrection, like Paul talked about, like we talked about earlier, that is the climax of everything. It's what makes everything come together. And so I encourage you to be intentional in celebrating and understanding God's timing and aligning with His calendar, aligning with His purposes. And this is something that, we're going to be unpacking as we prepare for this next month in a season of redemption. And so we just want to say Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Yes, for sure. Shabbat Shalom. Until next time, have a beautiful weekend.